This is not science.
If you read the books or watched the movies, you already know how to create a Horcrux. You need a murder, an object, and an evil spell. Mix all those ingredients and you get a vessel where a fragment of a soul is stored. In 1981, after the slaughter of the Potters, somehow Harry survives the killing curse, kills Voldemort, and turns into a Horcrux. According to Albus Dumbledore, Voldemort had rendered his soul so unstable that it broke apart when he committed those acts of unspeakable evil. J.K. Rowling doesn't explain much either. With Harry, it was just that Voldemort had destabilized his soul so much that it split when he was hit by the backfiring curse, and so a splinter of a soul flies off and attaches to the only living thing in the room. This information is rather vague and leaves many unanswered questions, like why Avada Kedavra backfired, or why killing other people would split Voldemort's soul apart. After all, he was killing people without a second thought, before his demise, during his wanderings, and after regaining his body. It doesn't seem like anything terrible happened to him then. His soul remained intact and no accidental Horcruxes were created. Voldemort even had a new Horcrux by turning Nagini into one, and again didn't suffer any consequences. So why would attempt to kill Harry have such disastrous results? There is something very wrong with the way Dumbledore and Rowling tried to explain away Harry's survival. Luckily, there are clues we can follow, and so we will. In one of the interviews, Rowling said this about Horcruxes. By definition, a Horcrux has to be made intentionally. We know that Voldemort didn't turn Harry into a Horcrux. Nevertheless, on that misfortunate night, there was a murder and a Horcrux was made. If a Horcrux has to be made intentionally, then someone did cast the spell and it wasn't Voldemort. The further down the rabbit hole you go, the darker it gets. And to reveal the truth, we have to dig deeper into the topic of Horcruxes and how much is known or unknown about them. It is apparent that decent witches and wizards, including Dumbledore, didn't know much about Horcruxes, and so a lot of false assumptions were made about them. The available literature has little to say about Horcruxes, and what's available is either cryptic or of limited usefulness. For example, the book Magic Most Evil has this to say about them. Of the Horcrux, wickedest of magical inventions, we shall not speak nor give direction. Only useful book on Horcruxes is Secrets of the Darkest Art, which provides specific instructions on the creation of a Horcrux, but it also misleads its readers. It states that Horcrux's creation rips the wizard's soul apart, and that the only possible cure is remorse. Doesn't that sound suspicious? Like a line from a Bible saying that all sins can be forgiven if a person truly atones for them. This, more than anything, shows how poetic is the understanding of Horcruxes. Dumbledore, Slughorn and other wizards have to rely on assumptions. For a very long time, the wizarding community believed that only one Horcrux could be created. But Voldemort creates more than one. Dumbledore thinks that creating too many Horcruxes makes one's soul fragile, and this way tries to explain Harry's survival, but after coming back to the body, Voldemort kills plenty more people, creates another Horcrux, and yet nothing terrible happens to him. According to Dumbledore, Voldemort was preserving the creation of his Horcruxes for significant deaths. But Voldemort has used a Muggle tramp and an Albanian peasant to create 2 of his Horcruxes. So, I have to put Dumbledore's assumptions aside and base this theory on events and logic. Here are a few. A Horcrux indeed has to be made intentionally. Otherwise, any serial dark magician would be creating accidental Horcruxes with every murder they commit. 2. A different person than the murderer can create a Horcrux. The Basilisk killed Moaning Myrtle, but Tom Riddle used her death to turn the diary into a Horcrux. Horcruxes are extraordinarily durable, and only exceptional magic can destroy them. But when the spell does not destroy a Horcrux, it can still scar it. If attacked, Horcruxes defend themselves and backfire spells. Dumbledore was mortally wounded and Harry Potter almost died. Horcruxes can only be created after committing murder, the supreme act of evil. Dumbledore assumed that Harry was turned into a Horcrux accidentally, and that was his biggest blunder. On the night of the murder of the Potters, we had all the prerequisites for the creation of a Horcrux. The death of James Potter, Harry as a vessel, and the only unknown is the caster of the spell. Knowing that Voldemort didn't cast it leaves only one capable suspect, Lily Potter. But why would Lily consciously choose to turn Harry into a Horcrux? I can only guess that it may have been an act of desperation or defiance, or both. On October 31st, 1981, Voldemort comes to the Potter's house. He enters, encounters James Potter, and kills him, while Lily Potter flees upstairs and hides with a baby in the nursery. She is in a desperate situation. It is beyond doubt that Voldemort came to murder her family. I believe Lily knew the Horcrux spell and turned Harry into one intentionally, hoping that it would protect her baby. Voldemort finally comes into the nursery, murders Lily Potter, and unbeknownst to himself casts Avada Kedavra at the Horcrux. This theory wouldn't be plausible without a few questions that need to be answered. Is there a limit on how many Horcruxes one can make? How come, of all people, Lily Potter knew the curse so terrible and vile? And most importantly, what does it mean to turn a human baby into a Horcrux? As I mentioned before, there are many assumptions about Horcruxes and only a few facts. So certain information can only be drawn from actual events and logical conclusions. One assumption that is contradicted by the events in the books is that the act of creating a Horcrux splits the wizard's soul and that it can only be done a limited number of times. As we have seen with Harry and later with Nagini, Voldemort was able to create more Horcruxes even after reaching the assumed limit. There might be a limit to the number of active Horcruxes at one time, but all the facts contradict the soul-splitting myth. It is said that to create a Horcrux, a wizard first had to deliberately commit a murder. This act, said to be the most supreme act of evil, would result in the murderer metaphysically damaging their own soul. But I think this is a poetic interpretation of what really happens. Don't we also say damaged or simply insane when we refer to murderers? We do, and for a good reason. because a person who murders and moreover does it repeatedly is considered to have lost his humanity and is no longer whole in the eyes of a society. A Horcrux seems to retain the identity of a person at the time of its creation. Tom Riddle, contained within the diary, took on the appearance, memories, and character of a 16-year-old Voldemort, almost like a backup or a copy of a soul, rather than a fragment. And I think that's exactly what a Horcrux is. When we return to the topic of how Lily Potter knew about the curse, we'll see that soul copying or soul imprinting might not be as uncommon or evil as certain wizards wanted you to believe. If you think about it, you might remember that Riddle's diary wasn't the only object in Hogwarts that had a mind of its own and an imprint of someone's appearance, character, and memories. Dumbledore deduced the number of Horcruxes that Voldemort has created from memory fragments of various people, which is a good detective work but doesn't provide any plausibility to the assumption that there is a limit on the number of Horcruxes a witch or a wizard can create. Horace Slughorn said this about the creation of Horcruxes: if the maker was later killed, he or she would continue to exist in a non-corporeal form, although there were methods of regaining a physical body. A very accurate description of what happened to Voldemort after his encounter with baby Harry. This means Voldemort had at least one more Horcrux that Dumbledore hadn't accounted for, and it was used to quote-unquote resurrect him when he died from attacking Harry. This course of events is very consistent and doesn't introduce any mysterious soul fractures. It also follows Occam's razor principle. The least complicated answer is most likely to be the right one. So I state that Harry's mom knew the Horcrux curse, and more importantly, knew how to cast it. She wasn't a dark wizard, far from it. She was a muggle born. So how? You might have noticed that photos in the wizarding world have some extraordinary properties. They move. Even the most simple images, like the ones in the newspapers, have people that move, retain mannerisms and moods of an occasion. Then we have paintings, where people have personalities imprinted into the works of art. While these impressions are only shallow versions of what an actual person's character is, they are much more advanced compared to photos. Just like the lady who guards the entrance into the Gryffindor common room, people in the paintings have unique memories, can remember new things, experience fear and joy, and can even take on some simple responsibilities. And finally, we have portraits of the headmasters of Hogwarts. They contain nearly perfect soul copies of the headmasters themselves, maintain all memories, character traits, and tastes. Most importantly, they retain their minds and give counsel and help the existing headmasters. They are almost like Voldemort from Tom Riddle's diary, except he could get back to life, while the dead headmasters are confined to their portraits. Of course, portraits are not Horcruxes, but most certainly the same branch of magic is used to create moving photos, interacting paintings, and thinking portraits. This magic never comes up in the books, except for one occasion. In the 5th year, Fred and George Weasley created a poster of Harry that talked and made fun of Dolores Umbridge. The magic that makes this possible is not mentioned, but is seen all over. I think any brilliant student who would pursue this field of magic would finally come to wonder if it is possible to make a perfect soul imprint. If such enthusiasts of the unmentioned magic dug deep enough, they would eventually discover Horcruxes, or at least the mention of them, and naturally plenty of warnings. However, nothing is sweeter than the forbidden fruit. This would explain how Voldemort found out about Horcruxes so early in his age. Remember that he inquired Slughorn about them while he was still very young, between the 2nd and the 4th year. Also, it would explain how Lily might have learned about them. Of course, knowing something and doing it is not the same. And it is still not clear how Harry's mother knew how to cast a Horcrux spell. But it is not very difficult to deduce. Hurting and evil doing requires much less skill than something positive or productive. Perilous spells are not always the hardest. Remember when Harry used Sectum Sempra without knowing its effects? It gashed Draco's face and chest, causing profuse bleeding. Harry did not practice the curse, he didn't even know what it does, only read and remembered its name. But who did Lily have? If Lily found a mention of Horcruxes, surely the only person she would dare to ask about them would be Snape. He was Lily's childhood friend, very knowledgeable and in love with her. Snape would go out of his way to find more information about the forbidden magic. I believe Snape found out what he could and told Lily about Horcruxes and the spell for creating them. And Lily remembered it in the darkest and most desperate hour of her life. This last part of the theory is most far-fetched and doesn't have a very solid foundation. But I'll let you be the judge of that. Horcruxes have unprecedented protective powers. Just imagine a witch or a wizard with that kind of defense. Knowing that Horcruxes are not as big a secret as we were led to imagine, why wouldn't people use this to their advantage? Death of a child is one of the most painful experiences a parent can go through, so why not protect them with a powerful spell like that? I know, murder is not the most appealing thing, but I can imagine a dark wizard family who could fancy a tradition of turning their children into Horcruxes as a kind of baptism. I mean, why didn't Voldemort ask someone to turn him into a Horcrux to gain such an advantage? Well, why didn't he, really? We need to put a few ingredients together to answer this question. Word Horcrux means a container of evil. Therefore, Horcrux spell turns the target into a jar where a soul can be stored. But what if the jar is already full? What does the Horcrux spell do then? It empties it to make room for another soul. However sad it may sound, Lily Potter didn't protect Harry when she used the curse. In her desperation, she most likely killed him, and it was the copy of the Voldemort soul who we call Harry and whose adventures we grew to love. You may chuckle or be outraged about this, and you may ask why Voldemort didn't rise back to the power in Harry's body. But remember, in The Half-Blood Prince, Albus Dumbledore stated that using a live being as a Horcrux was a risky business due to it being able to move around and think for itself. And that's the thing with turning living beings into Horcruxes. You are submitted to a new body and consequences of chance, circumstance, and choice. With an inanimate object, soul is essentially frozen. No individual activity is possible until it's triggered back into action by someone living. With the living, it's a bit different. They continue their own life, take their own path. Voldemort's soul in Harry's body had a new life and a new hope. He grew as a baby, had baby joys and sorrows, and childhood. Somewhat similar, but also different. Somewhat scary, but also hopeful. And experiences are ultimately what makes us the people that we are. Harry and Voldemort became mirror images of each other, shaped by subtle changes and most importantly decisions. Their lives were like a ball bouncing on a mirror, repeating similar actions but having very different consequences. Growing up without their real parents, discovering they were wizards at 11, buying the sibling wands at Ollivanders, both being considered for Slytherin, both ventured into the Chamber of Secrets, but Voldemort kills Moaning Myrtle, while Harry chooses to rescue Ginny. Intertwining paths but different choices. And in the end, new experiences, friendships and relationships that shaped Harry into the person we know, empowered him to abandon the evil lurking inside by choosing friendship over worship of frightened followers. Last but not least, I love the Harry Potter series. It is a magical experience. I wish there was more, and I think there is a way to revisit the places and events we love from completely different vantage points. Orson Scott Card wrote one of the best sci-fi stories, Ender's Game, but the book was not made into a movie as it lacked something. 14 years after publishing Ender's Game, Orson released a book that changed that. It was called Ender's Shadow, and showed events from the perspective of a different boy who was never visible in the original book, what was key to Ender's success. Well, I thought to myself, what if there was someone smarter than all other brilliant wizards, and figured out what happened to Harry on the night his parents died? What if that someone had a grandson whose sole mission was to make sure that things turn out well for Harry? What if it was because of this person that Harry ended up in the same cabin with Ron, and meeting Ron made him want to join Gryffindor instead of Slytherin? What if it was he who made sure Hermione knew the spell to deal with a plant in the Philosopher's Stone? What if he was prepared for this duty since his childhood by his grandmother, and pretended to be forgetful, even somewhat dumb, and generally a nobody, so he could go around unnoticed? Who cares what losers do in their spare time, right?
Still not science.